Welcome, everybody, to this research seminar. I'm very happy to see Martin O'Neill here and Markus Furendal. Going to talk about the new case for wage earner funds. So Martin is professor of philosophy at the University of York in United Kingdom, not Canada. I guess you say University of York or York University.
They're York University. We're the University of York. Very important.
Martin received his PhD in 2008. Was supervised by Tim Scanlon and Derek Parfit, and it's not that bad. And I think you wrote your thesis on something like freedom, fairness, and responsibility. And he's interested in social justice, liberty, equality, and things in this intersection of political philosophy and public policy. I've written several papers on that, but social justice and economic systems, on roles, democratic socialism and alternatives to capitalism, power, pre-distribution. I think the first time I read the term pre-distribution was in your work, and social justice. And also one book, as you mentioned, The Case for Community Wealth Building, came out in 2019. But not the least, you started out writing a very good paper on Wittgenstein and logical necessity, if I remember correctly. Markus Furendal is a postdoc in political science at Stockholm University. Recently finished his PhD in 2020 on Do Your Bit, Claim Your Share, which I actually have read all of it because I was in the committee, and supervised by Eva Ehrman. And his research interests are also in the kind of intersection between politics, economics, and philosophy. And now he's writing about global governance and artificial intelligence. So one wonders why you at Stockholm University and not here. Very welcome, both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Right, who shall I? So it's a great pleasure to be here in Stockholm. So the first time that Markus and I met in reality was about 25 minutes ago. So this is like a very strange artifact to the pandemic that we've written this paper. So we met at an online conference. We both were sort of.
You still like each other.
Yeah. Although he's taller than I realised from Zoom, but then again, young people are much taller than me. So anyway, so it's been very exciting to meet Markus in real life. I feel the force of the strangeness of being a man from the north of England coming to Stockholm to talk about Meidner and wage earner funds. So I'm not sure what the Swedish version of taking coals to Newcastle is, but I'm slightly conscious that I'm doing that, taking owls to Athens, as the Germans would have it. So be gentle with me and with Markus, who's so young that of course he wasn't around when these debates were happening. So what we want to do today is to talk about basically the case for the kind of wage earner fund type proposal that was associated with the work of Rudolf Meidner, and to say that it might be time, despite the difficult history that this proposal has in the political history of Sweden, it might be time to look again at this sort of proposal for forms of what we call collective capital institutions, where the wage earner fund proposal is one version of that kind of proposal. So in times of increasing inequalities, where there's a shift, as we see in the work of Thomas Piketty, from returns to labour to returns to capital, we need to think about institutional solutions that can deal with inequalities of wealth, inequalities of income, and inequalities of economic power. And what we're going to make the case for today is the thought that serious and sustained attention once again to this kind of wage earner fund type proposal might be especially appropriate now, given these sorts of economic shifts and given the kinds of problems of inequality that we now face in the 2020s. So what we're going to do today, we're going to look a little bit at the Swedish political debate around the wage earner funds from the 1970s, and look at the rationale that was offered at the time for these sorts of funds in terms of both their justification with regard to equality and with regard to democracy. So with regard to equality, this is a way of redistributing resources. With regards to democracy, it's also a way of redistributing power over economic decisions. So what we want to do is show that despite the historical changes since the 1970s, over the past 50 years or so, those two rationales still make the wage earner fund type proposal an attractive policy response to contemporary issues. So we'll look. So I'll hand over to Markus, especially for the more Swedish, Sweden-centric bit of our talk today. And then we'll sort of talk about the relevance of this kind of proposal in the current situation. And then we'll also talk a little bit about about a contrast really between the kind of collective capital proposals that one sees in something like the Meidner wage earner proposal and the more individualized proposals for trying to find a more egalitarian economic system associated with John Rawls's idea of a property owning democracy. And we're going to be making the argument that collective solutions are going to be more attractive when you consider issues related to stability and the development of the sense of justice within society. So what we're not going to do, we're not going to claim that wage earner fund type schemes are a silver bullet that can solve all problems that egalitarians see when looking at modern societies. This isn't meant to be, as you occasionally, I mean, if you think about the argument on basic income, some people think basic income is one good policy among others, but then there's another kind of view that really, wants to foreground that as the policy that will solve most problems. We're not making that kind of claim for the wage earner funds. We're just saying this is like one useful kind of institution within a broader mix. We're not going to necessarily claim that the version of the wage earner fund proposal that you had in the 1970s in Sweden is uniquely the best version. It rather identified a family of possible kinds of institutional solutions that are worth thinking through more carefully. But it's not necessary that that's uniquely the best version of that. And with regard to collective capital institutions and wage earner fund style proposals, what we just want to say is that they could, despite not necessarily being a silver bullet, or despite the version that was tried not necessarily being the right one, these sorts of institutions could constitute a crucially important element of a just basic institutional structure, and that therefore there ought to be a lot more attention from within political philosophy, political economy, from within whatever range of disciplines think about different sorts of economic settlements. We should be thinking a lot more about these kinds of institutional proposals. So we've got a very modest aim, which really is just to say that just as there's a lot of work on basic income or basic capital proposals, there should be a lot more work trying to think through these sorts of institutions. So I shall hand over to Markus.
Thanks. Just to provide some background from my position as well. I'm working with a person from the UK, and I wasn't born when all of this happened in Swedish political history, so it's been a bit difficult to parse out exactly what happened. I mean, also growing up in Sweden, it's like the wage earner funds are something that's sort of difficult to understand what really happened at the time if you weren't around. Because it seems to me that since then it's become one of these issues that you can just mention and people understand what it's about, but the details have perhaps been a bit lost. And for the labor movement, it seems like there's a real unwillingness to talk about this or re-engage with these ideas. And for the political right, it's almost like something that you can scare people with. It's like you can talk about contemporary political proposals and if you compare them to the wage earner funds, everyone understands that this is heading for disaster. It's a step too far or something. So it's been interesting for me working on this to actually try to go back to some of the sources and understand what was really there in the proposals. We primarily looked at Rudolf Meidner and Anna Hedborg and Gunnar Fond's proposal from 1975 and some of the issues around that, and not much on the other kinds of material. But anyway, so here's I guess the background, which most of you are sort of familiar with, I assume. During the decades after the Second World War, I mean, Sweden had this is the First World War, sorry. The Second World War, we had this Rehn-Meidner model in place to deal with the social democratic trilemma of trying to maintain some kind of full employment, this policy of wage solidarity and also economic growth. And I guess the Rehn-Meidner model, one of its central parts was this idea of a solidaristic system of wage bargaining and also co-determination. And with that in place, people were able to keep down wage differentials between workers, but also to keep employment levels very high. I mean, perhaps it's worth to stop for a minute to think about this solidaristic wage policy. I mean, with a really high degree of unionization and organization of laborers, it was possible not only to prevent different workers from underbidding each other, or I mean, it was possible to maintain some kind of collective bargaining system. But what I think Rudolf Meiner at least thought was really attractive about this was it also enabled a kind of justice-based way of or argument for maintaining some kind of equality between workers. Namely that people in the more profitable industries, workers in the more profitable companies, withheld their demands for higher pay increases because they felt some kind of solidarity with people who were working in industries or sectors that were going not as well. So there was kind of this idea that the kind of thing that you worked with, that's supposed to be the basis for your salary, and not whether the company that you're working in is going well or not. That's a really interesting idea, looking back at it from our much more individualized day and age, I think. But after a few decades of this, problems appeared on the horizon, and the unions talked about this in terms of excess profits, vinster. So the more profitable sectors of the economy, when workers didn't get pay increases despite the company going really well, that enabled capital owners instead to take this out as some kind of profit. So even though this policy increased equality between workers, it also increased the inequality between workers and owners of capital, and especially in the most profitable firms in the economy. So this, I guess, is the background for why the policy was proposed to begin with. Rudolf Meiner has talked about this in interviews later, that we needed some kind of way of dealing with this threat to the Swedish model for the solidaristic wage policy. And also at the time, I mean, a relatively large share of Sweden's private industry was in fact controlled by a very small number of families with large fortunes. So I think one figure that appears in the 1975 proposal penned by Meidner et al. Estimates that around 8% of the Swedish workforce is employed by companies controlled by the Wallenberg family, for instance. So just one family controls a really significant share of the economy. And that was also one of the things that the authors wanted to deal with, this kind of concentration of power. So at the 1971 Congress of LO, the Swedish Trade Union Confederation, they made a decision to commission a study to investigate policy responses to this, and they were given the job of developing proposals. Meidner was selected to chair this, and the objectives were three. First, to provide some kind of further development of a wages policy based on the principle of solidarity. They were also to address the problem of increased concentration of wealth, and finally they wanted proposals that could increase the influence that employees have over the economic process. And this is a picture of one of the reports that came out of this study or committee. And what was in the plan then? I guess it's pretty difficult to tell because they intentionally left some of the details out. I think some of these authors thought that we should set out the grand design here, and then details could be filled in at a later point as part of the public decision-making process. It's not up to us as experts to decide exactly where we should draw the line between different kinds of values or trade-offs, but that's something that should be up to politics to deal with. But anyway, in very broad strokes, the main idea was that a proportion of corporate profits should be redirected into newly created collective funds. and that these funds would be held or controlled by workers within each firm. So the kind of corporate profits wouldn't be paid out as dividends or wages to those who control these shares, but it would be kept in the companies working capital. So they would essentially create a share levy, which would be proportional to the profits of each firm, at least firms over 50 employees or 100 employees. That differs in different kinds of different versions of the proposals. Provide a different figure there, and that would happen annually. And then what would happen over time, I guess, is that the stock, when it's transferred into collective capital institutions, that would also gradually start shifting the control over the company to those who collectively own the stock, so the employees within the particular firm. Because the shares would also provide voting rights for the workers who control it, so that once the wage earner funds reached some degree of control over the shares, for instance 20% of equity in each firm, they would actually gain seats on the board of the companies, right? So,
Markus, can you explain what you mean with held by the workers, or what they meant?
I mean, it's not entirely clear exactly how this would be spelled out, and then the eventual way it worked out was different from the original proposal. But I think, yeah, one of the ideas would be that you would create a fund directly tied to the company that has put its profits into the fund, and then workers within that company would, through their union, appoint people who would be in charge of the voting share that fund controlled. So they could place people on the board. They could get some kind of democratic governance processes in order to influence what. I don't see
the democracy yet. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that's something we could return to. Yeah, and there's this idea that, I mean, I think we'll return to this, but there would probably be additional layers of governance to allow for other people outside of the company as well, and within the sector, and perhaps nationally as well, to gain some kind of influence over these kinds of funds. Anyway, the main thing that we're interested in this paper is this general trend, or the effect of this, namely that this kind of institution would gradually shift more and more power over Swedish capital into a form of public ownership. And that's the effect that we're really interested in this paper. What would that kind of effect have on an egalitarian society, I think. And also, I mean, importantly, this is not state ownership, but public ownership, because it's not controlled through the state directly. Let's see what... This is how Meidner put it at the time. Share issues restricted or directed to employee funds would gradually shift the weight of ownership towards the employees, since the funds would receive each year an issue of shares without the remaining shareholders having a similar entitlement. So you would actually not redistribute shares from existing shareholders to others, but you would dilute the value of their shares by creating new ones that would be controlled by the funds. This would involve a gradual redistribution of capital returns and control over investment decisions. And also we would start shifting from some kind of capitalist welfare state economy, some kind of mixed economy, to something we argue that would be completely new, a form of democratic socialism that hasn't yet existed. You want to say something about this, or should I?
No, you keep going.
Okay, yeah, great. So they explicitly mentioned two kinds of goals in the debate at the time, or in these proposals, and Meidner had this kind of vision that he's also expressed later on. The first goal of the funds would be to promote some kind of equality, the sharing of economic gains more fully with the workers. So recall the problem with the excess profits that went into the pockets of those who controlled capital. That kind of problem could be dealt with by this kind of institution, or at least they thought. Because, I mean, you could, yeah, that's a way of redistributing the profits from those who already own capitals to the funds controlled by the workers. But also, I think this was really important at the time, at least rhetorically. these funds or these schemes would be the next logical step in the democratization of society. So it had been many decades at this point since the voting rights was extended to basically everyone, and now a very strong and self-assured labor movement thought that it's time to take the next step and extend democracy to the economic sphere as well. So we shouldn't stop at the political sphere, but we should actually reach further here. So it's time to do that right now. And these funds were conceived as a way of doing that. And I think this is one of the things that we find most interesting about these funds, because it combines these both elements. So compared with similar schemes for profit sharing through collective capital ownership that lack these kinds of democratic aspects, I think this makes this particular proposal very attractive or interesting and to think about. So given that the funds are essentially collective, it's not like people individually or workers individually would gain something from it, like a boost to their private income or something like that. But the dividends could be deployed in many different ways. So for instance, after the 1975 discussion about it and before the 1976 decision at the Congress that I had a picture of earlier, LO put out a version of this proposal to studiecirklar, to grassroots members, in a very interesting process that involved over 18,000 people. And I think they just essentially asked what should we use these kinds of profits for? And people came up with many interesting examples. For instance, labor education, research and training, including adult education and training to boost financial literacy. So I guess this connects very strongly with this idea of lifting up the working class through providing further education, like this bildnings idea that was very strong in Sweden as well. So, I mean, given that the funds were collectively controlled and not paid out as dividends to individual workers, one could use money for these kinds of collective projects. But then, of course, what do you want to take over from here?
But Markus doesn't want to do the ABBA jokes, for which I can. But as you know, this didn't work. This didn't happen, right? The beautiful kind of proposal that you get in the 1975 and 1976 sort of outlines didn't really happen. Didn't come to fruition. The proposals seemed like a step too far. I mean, both for some of the more cautious elements in your Social Democratic Party, but I guess for the kind of capital interest in Swedish society as well. Famously, the manager of ABBA, Stickan Andersson, organised a benefit concert opposing the wage earner funds and assured the press that all 4 members of the group also opposed the funds. The clues were all there in the music, of course. After all, among ABBA's hits were Money, 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 with its infamous claim that it's a rich man's world. Exactly. Yeah. And and of course, Winner Takes It All, long considered to be about their various divorces, but now clearly readable as a parable of life under hyper-capitalism. I'd read somewhere that this was one of the largest demonstrations in Swedish history, the demonstration against the wage earner fund. So look, we're being pretty courageous here in sort of arguing for the resurrection of the proposal that basically got people out onto the streets against an egalitarian and democratic proposal. At any rate, the Social Democrats were ousted from office in 1976, and when they got back in power 6 years later, there was a circumscribed proposal that sort of limped onto the statute books, which lacked many of the original design features. So you got a kind of a descendant of this proposal came into being, but it didn't have the kind of the sort of features of the much more interesting and radical 1970s proposals. Okay, so all right, so let's talk a little bit about why this might be of more than antiquarian or historical interest. So, I mean, the problem that Meidner was facing was this, essentially the problem of excess profit. So if you have this kind of solidaristic wage policy, then you get these kind of pockets of sort of very kind of excessive capital returns within the structure of the economy. And there was this attempt to sort of think about how you could manage that phenomenon whilst nevertheless retaining other aspects of kind of egalitarian public policy. One thing that strikes us as very kind of interesting here about our context relative to the context then is that, of course, this thought that there were sort of accelerating capital returns in particular areas of the economy. This was happening. This was a problem that was puzzling, the kind of theorists of social democracy, puzzling sort of people on the left, at a point that actually, in retrospect, looks like looks like a period of actually, when things were like unusually good for workers by historical standards, and actually where the labour share of national income in many societies was, historically at a very, very high level. So, I mean, this is, I think, a very striking graph from an OECD paper on the pattern of the kind of shift from returns to labour to returns to capital that one's seen over what you might think of as the kind of neoliberal era. So here you have various G20 countries, and the shift in terms of like the share of national income that's going every year to the owners of capital as opposed to people who work for a living. And as you say, I mean, I think of, that period of 1970 to 2014, in my country, in the United Kingdom, was, the period that had the Thatcher union reforms, that had really, a kind of a fundamental shift in the organisation of the economy, and where that's only associated with what a kind of maybe a 6 or 6.5% shift in the share of national income over the period that's being looked at there from labour to capital. But as you see, in many other countries, that shift is much higher over that period. And I mean that's just pointing towards some sort of empirical evidence there. But I mean, I guess on the kind of theoretical side, if you for those that are sort of convinced by Thomas Piketty's work, one would think that over time, given sort of a relatively long period where the rate of return to capital is higher than the rate of growth of the economy as a whole, that's like, theoretically, it just seems very straightforward to think that that's going to be a general feature of how economies develop over time, right? That there's going to be more a higher and higher share of national income going as capital returns as opposed to going to wages. So it seems to us that, Meidner was facing a kind of special problem of excess capital returns, but we face a much broader kind of general problem of excess capital returns. This is a kind of structural feature of the economies that we're in now. So actually, the thing that struck Meidner and his colleagues as a way of trying to tap that kind of excessive return to capital in one area, and this proposal that was doing a very particular kind of job within a very different economic context, actually can give a kind of structural approach to thinking about how to deal with that much broader and more general phenomenon that we face now in the 2020s. So, thinking about the sort of, if you like, the contemporary egalitarian argument. So Meidner conceived of the wage earner funds as a way to make the Meidner model sustainable in light of this special problem of capital returns. But now the profit sharing mechanisms of the wage earner funds seem well suited to counteract this more general problem of excess capital returns by harnessing rather than restricting the rise of the capital share. So, if you think about Piketty's work, it basically creates a sort of, if you like, a kind of a dilemma for people who want a more egalitarian economy, right? So if the unchecked trends of the economy are towards sort of shifting returns to capital rather than labour, what do you do about that as policymakers, as you know, as political movements that are sort of interested in trying to get a more egalitarian outcome? You can either push against that, right, and say that, right, we need to just sort of, we need to drive down the rate of return to capital, or we need to do something to kind of try and raise wages in the economy. Or on the other hand, you could try and say, okay, well, look, given that feature of how the economy is developing, is there something you can do to kind of turn that to more egalitarian ends? Can you sort of have that capital return more broadly spread? Can you sort of get a broader set of claims on those capital returns, as opposed to trying to sort of push against the tendencies of the economy? And presumably, you know, there's something. I mean, Markus and I were talking earlier about you know, in some of Meidner's sort of more autobiographical writings towards the end of his life, where he's contrasting, you know, how things were for people trying to think about egalitarian policy in the 70s as opposed to the 90s, and where he's saying even then, you know, like, it was so much easier for us, there was higher growth, you know, it was a lot easier to kind of have forms of redistribution where that didn't pinch, and where you weren't having to kind of make such sort of difficult, politically awkward choices. And the vista looks much more difficult, he thought, you know, let's say even in the 1990s. Well, that vista looks much, much more difficult now in an era of low growth, and where we really do have to think about sort of dispersing capital returns as well as just thinking about labour income. So, one thing we don't, that would be very interested, I guess, to talk about in the Q&A, we've not really put it on the slides, is the fact that this proposal has had one kind of interesting afterlife very recently in the US and the UK. So Bernie Sanders' policy programme had a version of the wage earner fund proposal, and the UK Labour Party fought the 2019 general election on a policy platform that had another different version of this kind of proposal as well. So I think it's no coincidence that, if you like, sort of, you know, radical social democratic parties in the last few years looking around for approaches that might deal with this problem of the kind of the sort of structural shift in where economic rewards are going within the economy, have kind of come back to this kind of proposal. So, I mean, if you think about running something like this proposal over a period of time, the scheme would gradually lead to a situation where companies would neither be kind of purely private entities that are just having to kind of tolerate state interference, nor would they be state-run enterprises, but rather every large economic enterprise would become this kind of interesting sort of public-private hybrid. Equality would be pursued then not by simply taxing and redistributing profits, but rather by giving kind of workers at least a stake in public companies and their profits. So Gustav, in his very kind introduction, was talking about the idea of pre-distribution. So you might think that, you know, this kind of proposal, by changing the sort of structural features of how corporate entities work and how they operate, is a way of sort of not having to rely so much on the tax system to do the job of redistribution. You instead build in this kind of structural mechanism that means that you don't have to do quite so much redistributive work. But with regard to the democratic rationale, wage earner funds can disperse control over economic decisions more widely among people whose interests are at stake. And you might think, you know, there's just a kind of very straightforward, commonsensical way of thinking that's a good way to go. So people who are affected by or subjected to decisions should have some say about them, yet the way capitalist societies are set up, only a fraction of the decisions that affect public life are under any kind of democratic control. So over time, this kind of scheme allows the democratically controlled unions to exercise influence over those decisions as shareholders. And it's worth, I think, just flagging at this point, if you look at, maybe one contrast between the Meidner proposals and some of the more recent ones is that obviously Meidner as someone working for the LO, and given the sort of structure of the Swedish labour movement at the time, the thought was that, these would be union funds, and the democratic influence that people had would be exercised, qua union members. The more recent version, so if you think about the thing that ends up being in Bernie Sanders's policy programme, or the kind of UK Labour proposals, don't have the same role for the unions. Instead, what they think of are more that you're setting up sort of sui generis collective institutions within each firm, where your membership is not necessarily, with your union member hat, but rather you're, as an employee at this firm, you're also a voting and participating member of this other kind of institutional structure that then has a kind of autonomy. And I think, that's still obviously within the spirit of the Meidner proposals, but it has a kind of interesting difference in that way. So I think going beyond, sort of, let's say, German forms of co-determination or other ways of granting workers influence, this kind of collective ownership looks to put this kind of democratic control on a more secure footing. So it tries to build it into the very kind of ownership structure of and the kind of ongoing operation of the corporation. And I think as long as you kind of share that, that democratic intuition that, why, as Markus was saying, if we're Democrats, why wouldn't we want to extend the sort of zone of democratic influence? Then I think, there's just a straightforward way in which this seems quite attractive. There's also, and this is something we talk a little bit about in the paper, there's also, and it's something I guess that Meidner obviously talks about as well, there's also a kind of structural constraints argument. So wage earner funds not only enable us to extend democracy to the economic sphere, but they also offer a defence against unchecked economic decisions intruding into democratic decision-making in the political sphere. So Josh Cohen talks about this idea of structural constraints. So as he puts it, investment, so if decision-making about like the long-run shape of investment are left to a narrow kind of set of capitalist interests, this limits the democratic character of the state by subordinating the decisions and actions of the democratic state to the investment decisions of capitalists. Political decisions are structurally constrained because the fate of parties and governments depends on the health of the economy on investment decisions by capitalists, and investment decisions by capitalists on their expectations of profits. While groups other than capitalists also control strategic resources and can use that control to constrain decision-making, the structural constraints argument holds that the power of capitalists and the fact that everyone's welfare depends on their decisions singles them out for special attention. And this really, it fits with something really interesting in Meidner, where he's saying that, look, it's precisely because you're going to kind of have more a kind of broader-based democratic input at the kind of board level into firm governance. Precisely because you can do that, it's more likely that the behaviour of these entities is going to fit better with the kind of overall aims that are being pursued by a government in a democratic society, that you're going to find ways of sort of lessening that kind of tension between government and business. So he has a kind of interesting argument that basically ends up thinking that, this is a way of having to sort of reduce that kind of antagonistic relationship and sort of reduce a kind of model whereby, the state is having to kind of, as a matter of industrial policy or whatever, sort of just restrict various sorts of choices that firms might otherwise make, by trying instead to engineer the situation where you get more a kind of broader based expression of the kind of democratic will through different sorts of forums within the organisation of the economy. So, do you want to say anything more about that stuff, Markus?
No, I could say something about this later on, but you go ahead and...
Okay, yeah. All right, so
and contrast them. Yeah.
so one thing that that sort of struck us thinking about the kind of Meidner type proposal is that there's a really interesting contrast with the sorts of writing on socioeconomic regimes that you get in Rawls, and then in the sort of literature thinking about Rawlsian ideas of a property owning democracy. So Rawls's critique of the welfare state, I'll lay it out here. So Rawls says, so when he talks about welfare state capitalism, he's thinking of just kind of post-war mixed economy welfare states. He says they reject the fair value of the political liberties, and while they have some concern for equality of opportunity, the policies necessary to achieve that are not followed. They permit very large inequalities in the ownership of real property, productive assets and natural resources, so that the control of the economy and much of political life rests in few hands. Right, so that thought that if economic control is very narrowly held, that ends up turning into a kind of misallocation of political power as well. And although, as the name welfare state capitalism suggests, welfare provisions may be quite generous and guarantee a decent social minimum covering the basic needs, a principle of reciprocity to regulate economic and social inequalities is not recognised. So, on Rawls's view, you couldn't have a just society in a redistributive welfare state that didn't also think about the distribution of capital holdings, that didn't really take seriously, who really kind of owned the property there and who made the decisions about the kind of development of that economy over time. And that you could do an awful, you could have a very generous system of redistribution. You could make sure that the standard of living for the least well-off was very good in a society that didn't address that, but nevertheless had forms of redistribution and public provision of services and so on. But if you wanted a genuinely just society, you had to find a way to go beyond the kind of traditional welfare state and instead try to think about the capital distribution a lot more. Now, Rawls's solution to that, this idea of a property owning democracy, was the idea that what you would basically do is have a very egalitarian distribution of capital, right? So where the idea is that that's nevertheless a kind of private distribution, right? So everyone would have a capital holding, everyone would have a capital income as well as a labour income. But the thought is that that might just be that everyone has a sort of portfolio of equities or whatever it might be. It's not necessarily. He's not imagining the sorts of institutional structures that you get with the kind of collective capital institutions that you get on the Meidner proposal. So Rawls and Meidner, we think, have got an interest. I mean, I don't suppose they were reading each. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure they were on each other's radar, but there was some really structurally interestingly similar thoughts going on there. So Rawls identifies the limits of a merely redistributive welfare state that excludes the questions of the ownership of capital and says, that can do a lot for you, but it can't deliver social justice. Similarly, Meidner's plan was in part motivated by the fact that even, perhaps the most generous and redistributive welfare state that's ever existed, which had already done a tremendous amount to create a more egalitarian society, was running up against the kinds of limits that Rawls identified, right? Especially with regard to, the distribution of decision-making power there, right? Both in terms of thinking about either about equality or about democracy. There's only so much you can do unless you really address the pattern of capital ownership. So Meidner arguably saw that Sweden in the early 70s was at or near the limit of what could be achieved within the redistributive paradigm of the post-war welfare state, where the underlying ownership of capital and hence control over investment and the evolution of the economy is nevertheless highly unequal. So his proposal is for the creation of a kind of institution that would herald the transition from that kind of regime to something more fundamentally egalitarian. Now Rawls was, if you like, in the realm of theory, facing exactly the same kind of issue, but his response is more it's more, if you like, North American and individualized, as opposed to Meidner's more sort of collectivized, sort of European solution. So Meidner's thinking about, what kind of collective institution can solve this problem. Rawls is thinking about what kind of private distribution of ownership of capital can solve this kind of structural problem. But we think that the Meidner type proposal is it's got some interesting advantages over the Rawls type proposal. Especially if you think about some of these issues around structural constraints and the way that investment decisions can sort of run against democratic decisions. So we've got in the full written version of this, we've got this idea that we call a mutual fund property owning democracy. So imagine a really egalitarian distribution of capital, right? So everyone's got their kind of stock portfolio of that's giving them sort of dividends. Everyone's got a capital income as well as a labour income. But this is all but it doesn't have a kind of institutional reality. This isn't like held through some sort of democratic structure, but it's just a kind of private capital holding that everyone has. And it's all, let's say, highly intermediated, right? There's a big financial sector that's managing these kind of egalitarianly distributed capital holdings. And so you've solved, if you like, the kind of distributive problem of having sort of very unequal ownership of productive property, but you've not solved the kind of democratic problem, and you might then end up facing some of these problems about structural constraints. So imagine that all citizens have a capital stake, but the capital stake is held in the form of something like a mutual fund. Holdings of equities are broadly dispersed throughout the society, held as financial assets in a manner that sees those holdings mediated through the structures of a number of intermediate institutions. In that kind of a property-owning democracy, there's one sense, right, in which the class divisions between workers and capitalists would have been abolished. Everyone is both worker and capitalist. Oh, yeah, good point of it. But there's another sense in which that class interest can still be in play, because the way in which investment decisions would get made by the people who actually sort of controlled those resorts, by the intermediaries that were making those sorts of decisions, wouldn't reflect kind of democratic deliberation. So there's a problem, if you like, about the way in which in a Rawlsian type property-owning democracy, you could get still sort of a residual sort of capitalist class interest that was still there, even in what might, in another way, look like a classless society. Gustav is telling us that time is short, so we will draw towards a conclusion. So the fundamental thought, and hopefully we can discuss this further in the Q&A, is that the democratization, the possibility of democratization that you get with collective institutions that involve kind of deliberation, that involve thinking about the range of interests that people might have other than just kind of maximizing financial returns through their capital holdings, allow you to have a much more a society with a lot more kind of democratic texture and a lot more capacity for people to kind of engage in actually setting the kind of setting the direction of their society as a kind of as a collective economic enterprise over time. And that one of the worries about Rawls' more individualized way of solving this problem of inequality with regard to ownership of capital is that it doesn't have that kind of democratic possibility. So I'll just very quickly talk about Mrs. Thatcher and then we'll stop. So the thought here is that there are good Rawlsian reasons for preferring something like a collective Meidner type solution to Rawls' own idea of property-owning democracy. And this is connected with Rawls' idea of the sense of justice. So the thought is that, if you think about the the participants within a shared scheme of having a just society together. They're not sort of they're not kind of just Homo economicus dropped from out of nowhere. They're people whose sense of themselves, sense of their values is in part shaped by the institutions that they sustain together, and that there's something about having that project of shared collective institutions that's going to feed back into the sense of people being engaged in a collective endeavour within the economic domain. So there's a sense in which Margaret Thatcher was a very good Rawlsian. When she sold off council housing in the UK to people, when she basically took a collective community asset and turned that into an individualised asset, part of what she was doing was trying to change people's self-conception and their conception of how they related to one another as economic agents. As Thatcher put it, economic to the method, but the object is to change hearts and minds. And that in a way, it's kind of a Rawlsian thought as well, that one's sense of oneself as a citizen is going to be structured by the institutions in which one participates. And I think if you take that thought seriously, thinking about the potential for collective capital institutions, for collective capital formation, is going to be very, very important, because the more individualized sorts of solutions to the limits of redistribution that you see in rules might come up against this kind of problem, that they're not going to be sufficiently democratic, and they're not going to kind of structure people's sense of how they relate to others in a way that's going to foreground the sense of them being democratic citizens engaged in a project together, and not just individuals who want to maximize a financial return. So I'll take us to there. Nice picture of Rudolf Meidner. Our conclusion, super modest, right? Is that these ideas are very important and deserve much, much more scrutiny than they've been getting. And whatever kind of sense there might be in Sweden of sort of running away from the kind of the horror of the failure of what happened, that the core ideas there are of such value that it might be, maybe 50 years is enough time to get over the trauma and start to kind of think about how they might work within a different kind of economic and political setting. So we'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk. I guess at least we agree with the conclusion. I'm now going to tell you a little bit of the question and answer period. So the first half hour will be filmed, and for you online, we use the chat function as usual. And since we are a mix of research from different fields, the people online especially, but also here, if I don't know it, tell me about your discipline, so we know where you're coming from. And we do a hand for a new question, finger for a follow-up, and you write that in the chat if you're online. And I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question. I don't usually do that, but I will, since Bo and I had quite an interest in this and was running something on this. I think from what you're saying that you haven't read that, so some of the question unfortunately will be from that. First, I think you got the wager funds more right than most people, but not completely right. So I think it was great. I mean, you said there was two kinds of goals, sharing economic gains and democratization of society. You might have found something that I haven't seen, but I didn't see much of the talk about the democratization. So I also noticed that you didn't have any quotes from Meidner about democratization on your slides. And maybe you found something so you can convince us that really that was high on the agenda. But of course, and you did just slightly mention this, that productivity and efficiency was very important. So it was not only about keeping down the salaries in profitable company, but actually getting them up in companies that were not that productive, so you would have them going bankrupt and replaced by more efficient company. But that I didn't see so much in your presentation, so you could say something about that. Then, and this is a little bit more unsure about, it might be coming later on, but there was some discussion about having a national capital, a capital under national, because they were starting worrying about internationalization. Might more have come later on in the discussion. So I'd like to hear more about that. And then the second question, you spoke a lot about democracy, and this would make it more democratic. You never said what kind of idea of democracy you have in mind, and I'm not very convinced. Definitely not the way it turned out and the way Meidner proposed it, that it is on a sound conceptual democracy, more democratic. So let me give you this case. Let's say you have a number of capitalists here in Stockholm owning some company up north in Sweden, and they decide to take all the decision democratically among themselves. We don't think that make it more, in an interesting sense, so much more democratic. And why is that? Because the people relevantly affected by the decision, the people working in the company up north, they don't have an input. Now, let's say instead of this capitalist, we have the union, the central union in Stockholm deciding this. In what sense is that interestingly more democratic? And as you see, the way it was done in Sweden was really the unions deciding, and the democratic influence on the union from the local level, that's a pretty far away from that. So I wasn't at all convinced that there is a necessary connection between wage earner funds and substantial increase in democracy. You have to add a lot of premises how it's organized. You grew towards that, I think, towards the end, talking a bit about Bernie Sanders, maybe it should be in kind of the local shop level. That would be very different from the Meidner. That was not what he was thinking about. So please.
Should I?
Yeah,
I'll do the first part at least. So this is a very good question, and I guess this is sort of a boring answer, a two-part answer. But first, just to remind you, you can see that, yeah. So the second point here, I mean, this isn't really a paper where we claim that the specific wage earner funds proposal that was on the agenda in 1970 Sweden would have actually achieved these kinds of objectives that they set out.
But did they set out to make it more democratic?
Yeah, I'll get back to that, in a minute. So we're not claiming anything specific, I guess. Apart from describing the proposals at the time, I think we're not claiming that they specifically would achieve these kinds of objectives. And the paper and the talk is about this idea and the whole, concept of collective capital ownership, which would, if the details are worked out correctly, then perhaps we could achieve these kinds of objectives. But secondly, as important, I think it's perhaps an overstatement. I think the details are in the paper, so we provide quotes and a much more detailed discussion there, also of the details of the actual proposals. So we'll have to refer you to that if you're interested, especially the end notes. But I think at least Meidner in his talk at the time and also afterwards stressed the democratic aspect. But he was a labor union economist, and he wasn't part of the Social Democratic Party, and they were much more worried about this kind of rhetoric, I think. And if I recall correctly, I think Palme especially had a very difficult tightrope to walk between accepting whatever the unions proposed and also reconciling that with other kinds of political aspirations that they had and making it politically feasible. So I think they much more downplayed the democratic aspect of it. And also importantly, towards the end of the 70s, as the economic crisis really hit Sweden and the global economy, the third goal was introduced, which was to accumulate capital necessary for investment. So that was introduced in 1978, if I recall correctly. And that was much more important in the parliament bill that passed in the early 80s.
National capital for investment.
Exactly. So the actual proposal was much more like, we need more capital for the ATP-fonderna, the pension system. And this is a way of raising capital that could then be used to get us out of this economic hardships. So the economic democracy aspect was severely downplayed in favor of the dispersal of wealth, the egalitarian argument, and also this third argument that was added afterwards. So perhaps, I don't know. But then again, and perhaps you want to say something about the second part of the question,
quickly,
because
you should look into what kind of conception of democracy Meidner had. I think that's more compatible with this idea that EU would become more democratic if you just nationalized all the companies, which one can oppose on good grounds.
Yeah, exactly. And then, if you want to take over.
Yeah. So, just to pick up on that thought that, it's got to do, I take it, with the origin of the proposals that you actually had in Sweden, the fact that they were coming out of the Labour Federation, that they've got this central role for the unions, and and also that degree of centralization where, there might be a worry about the union bureaucracy, as it were, kind of getting a lot of power from this, but sort of workers in particular firms not really getting that. So it seems to me that, there's something quite promising about, let's say, some of the versions of these kinds of proposals from the past 5 years or so, where that element isn't there, and where you have, both the thought that the relevant decision makers will be the workers just in that particular firm, but also the thought that could, that there could be different levels of governance here. So it seems to me this is, to agree with Markus, really, it's not about defending one particular precise version of this, but really, depending on the way that one elaborates one's conception of what would be democratically valuable here, there are different sorts of governance structures, different kinds of stakeholders that could be brought in, different ways in which you could think about how these sorts of funds were governed. But that central idea of having, funds of this kind built into the structure of the corporate form, and turning the kind of private corporation into this hybrid that has this kind of this extra element. That central idea is an incredibly powerful one, and it's an adaptable one that can then, sort of find different.
You agree there's no direct connection with increased democracy. It just depends on the design. And secondly, everything you say seems to be much more compatible with having worker-owned companies.
Well,
cooperatives. So why not go for that?
Right, so to that, I think there's a very good answer. Because, look, there's two different sorts of problems you might have. So if I had a magic wand and could specify absolutely any economic structure I want, what do I want my just society to look like? That's one kind of question. Another kind of question might be, given that we're roughly round here and round now, and given that we can start to change the sorts of institutions we have, what would be a good pathway from here? Now, I think, this is an answer to that second kind of question, right? So if you could magically, capitalize an economy of co-ops and set that going, well, that'd be really interesting. But this is a kind of proposal that actually, it builds within the kind of the structures that are already there, and it gives you a kind of path towards transformation.
I'm not going to push you further on that. I thought the same thing was about cooperatives. They can grow in the belly of the beast.
But I'm just going to say, I'm going to absolutely take the faint praise of being able to come to Stockholm and to be told by Gustav, well, this is more right than wrong, and it's more right than most. That's good. I can live with that.
Boo.
Thank you. I think it's wonderful that these issues are again coming up on the table. I was a colleague to Rudolf Meidner for 1.5 years, so I have this sort of in my DNA. Two things. I think Bruce Ackerman is a well-known political philosopher. He starts his book, Social Justice in the Welfare State, with the following sentence: let's pretend that we live in a world with a perfect technology of implementation. And I can tell you, as an implementation researcher, there is no such thing, right? And I think this is what I call the political philosopher's disease, starting from very fine principles of justice and then ignoring two things. Can this be implemented without creating bureaucratic nightmares? And is it at all possible to get electoral support for this? An interesting thing with the wage earner funds was that when the discussion started, about 50% of union members supported it. And at the end, when they were actually introduced, it was down to 24%. So the left completely lost this discussion. Also, the wage earner funds were very different from all the successful social democratic reforms that has been very clear on individual rights, right to education, right to healthcare. It was all the time unclear which companies would the fund own sharing. That was never on the table. It was also unclear what would it actually mean for those workers who were working in this. How would you create justice between workers working in companies where the wage earner funds had shares to those who didn't? So there were layers of unclear things here that were never solved. And I think this is one of the problem with this sort of approach is that you may construct either electoral backlashes or bureaucratic nightmares that will backfire against our fine principles of justice if you ignore this. Now, I think the major problem with wage earner funds was that they were actually built on the fundamental capitalist idea that it's the ownership of capital that should give power. And this is the major fundamental mistake in all this debate. And this is an argument, it's not mine, it comes from a famous economist, David Ellerman. In a market economy, it cannot be ownership of capital that gives power, because you cannot own other people. Slavery is actually not allowed, right? It's the renting contract. So in a market economy, capital can hire labor, rent labor, and then capital have the decision about the production. But all of us in this room, we can start a business, and then we rent some capital, and then we decide. And so this is the fundamental Marxian and leftist mistake, to think that it's the ownership of capital. And wage earner funds were exactly built on this idea. If we have the capital, we decide. But that is not how modern market economy works, especially not in the high-tech industry. I'm a little surprised that you do not take into account many employee stock ownership companies in the United States, where I think they are 7,000, it's 10 million workers. And one thing they do is exactly what you are after and I am after. They actually redistribute a lot of capital to the workers directly. I think when you introduce the unions here, you will come in for a surprise. I think 8 years ago, one of the most well-known labor economists who have been studying such cooperatives and employee stock ownership companies for 40 years, Robert Freeman at Harvard, he was hired by the Swedish blue-collar union to write about new ideas for the union movement. And he presented this idea of employee stock ownership plans, where sort of you would transfer the power to companies from owners to workers without the workers having to take any economic risks. This is a big thing in the United States, if I understand it. And this is the Bernie Sanders plan. It's not wage earner funds. But he presented this to the Swedish unions. And you know what their answer were? We will never do this. They hate it. Why? Because it would mean that the unions would lose their power, of course. So I have a paper, I will send it to you, showing that the big hindrance for economic democracy in Sweden are the unions. They are fundamentally against this. And this is, of course, a big problem for any sort of plan here, because the wage earner funds, I'm sorry to say, it will be a no-starter in Sweden.
Do you want to go first, or will I go first?
Yeah, sure. There were a lot of questions there. I could say something about the political philosopher's disease, I guess, or the dilemma, perhaps. I mean, that's the predicament that we're in.
Why we're not guilty of it. We partly own up to it, I guess. But again, I mean, just to remind you of the disclaimer that we're not actually talking about the WEFs in Sweden in particular. It's not that everything hinges on whether that proposal is ultimately attractive or would be politically feasible or anything. But we're much more interested in the general idea here. But so many issues. Did you have any idea about the political philosophers? I mean, we're remarkably not guilty of that, unlike many other political philosophers, right? Because what we're precisely not doing is just starting with looking to kind of derive the one unique institutional form from a small set of principles, but just trying to, I mean, methodologically, right? It's about sort of looking at the history of kind of interesting proposals that have actually been made by people facing real problems of of trying to think about how you democratize the economy more, how you have a more egalitarian outcome, and then trying to think about concrete institutional forms, and then trying to think, well, okay, what's living and what's dead in these proposals, right? What's the value there, and what can what should be left behind, and what actually should be kind of rescued from what was no doubt a very difficult kind of political experience in Sweden for these proposals. So I think that I agree with you, but that's a good criticism for many political philosophers, but not for us.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Compared with the UBI discussion, universal basic income, which has been, I mean, Lucas Stanchik and Alex Gorovich has this article about assuming a can opener, like an economist thinks about how people would start an economy on a deserted island after a shipwreck, and the economist says, well, assume a can opener, and then they can just open whatever food that they find. And something similar is true, they say, about the UBI discussion, where people just assume that we already have this kind of very strong labor power in place in societies, and they could easily just raise the capital needed for a UBI and wouldn't face any kind of objections and political antagonism. I think we're trying to be sensitive to that kind of worry, and compared with the UBI proposal, I think we believe that one of the strengths in this is the gradual process. I mean, in the best of worlds, perhaps not right now, but we could start to gradually shift the economy to this new kind of economic regime.
Surprisingly, according to the European Union and Special Institute for Employee Stock Ownership Plans, the worst institutional structure for this to happen. So in the United States, for example, workers can take over a company by having the company as the security. This is legally impossible in Sweden. And the unions are absolutely against it, absolutely. They will say no, no, no. So this is the magic. Another thing about rules, I think your discussion is a little dated. I would suggest you take a look at Edmondson's book, Rawls, the Reticent Socialist, because he changed his mind the last 6-7 years of his life from welfare capitalism to liberal socialism, actually. So in a reticent way.
Oh God! Don't get me started on that. So, I think Edmondson is right that Rawls probably ought to be a liberal socialist, and I can send you a paper where I make this case at some length. I don't think he's right that actually Rawls was, as a matter of fact, but that's a rabbit hole if I fall down it. Well, one point that I did want to respond to was, look, I agree with you 100% about the element point. Right? There's nothing magic that the kind of the capital ownership should give those rights of control, and of course you can kind of pull those two things apart. And the fact that we don't do that, it's not because it's not because we're making an error in assuming that things have to be that way. It's precisely that attempt to be sensitive to the constraints of reality, and the thought that if you're trying to create a more egalitarian institutional structure within roughly the structure you have now, then taking seriously the firm structures as they are, and how you could kind of so in an economy where capital ownership gives seats on the board and gives this kind of power and control, what can you do there to kind of spread power and to democratize given the existence of that structure? I mean, on the ESOPs and so on, I mean, we do just kind of refer to there's a very good book by Thomas Hanna about different forms of collective and public ownership in the US. And I mean, going back to our sort of no silver bullet point, I mean, I take it that what we see ourselves as doing is thinking that if you have a richer and more diverse ecosystem of kinds of economic institution, that might be a good way of trying to get a more democratic and egalitarian society. So it's absolutely not opposed to any sort of other sort of structure that might exist. And in fact, I mean, that's in Meidner too, right? Where he's talking, he's not hostile to co-ops. He's very much thinking that there's going to be a plurality of different kinds of institutional structures in the economy, but just that something like this can be, one element among others. But there's a huge amount there, so I look forward to reading your paper on this as well.
Very good. Moa, and send the microphone, please.
Thank you. This is very interesting. So I'm a sociologist, and I probably know less about wage earner funds than maybe I should. So this is quite like a general question. But so I was listening this morning to an interview with workers in Pakistan who are creating the footballs for the World Cup. And listening to your talk now, it made me think about how, because one thing that I think has happened, I like the idea about the wage earning funds. It seems reasonable. But how does the globalization impact these ideas about inequality and democracy in the sense that more today than in the 1970s, people work, companies are owned maybe in one country and then workers work in another company. And there could be people working for Adidas in the US, and then the footballs are created in Pakistan. How does modern ideas about the wage earner contract or funds, how do they think about this? How do they solve this?
Shall I?
Yeah. Sure.
Right. So, I think that was something that that Meidner, I think, was already grappling with in the 70s, even where the thought there was that ideally you'd hope that sort of similar sorts of institutional structures would exist in other places as well, and where certainly, it's really interesting sort of reading that discussion that in a way a lot of the kinds of problems that come up when you think about corporate taxation come up as well when you think about trying to impose these sorts of structures. So whether you can treat subsidiaries as kind of separate to parent companies, and especially on the kind of Meidner type proposal where the annual issuance of new shares was proportional to profits, how you attribute profits to subsidiaries of different firms and so on. So I think that there are a lot of sort of similar issues there to ones that we grapple with when you think about tax policy as well. One thing that strikes me, given some of the kind of practical difficulties, is the sense of and what was super interesting about this getting on the agenda in terms of like the Sanders campaign and so on, is the thought that it's very hard for one small country, a relatively small country, to kind of impose this sort of change to corporate structure within that economy. Whereas if an idea like this, let's say in the context of the US or at the EU level or whatever, could have a lot more potential than just sort of being done at the level of a national economy. So I think, that's just a kind of thought towards that. But I think that there was an awareness from the outset that there's going to be a lot of sort of technical difficulty, which maybe goes back to Bo's point about it not always being clear even from the outset which firms would be affected, and if you were a Swedish subsidiary of a firm that operated elsewhere or whatever, how this would work. So I think that there are considerable technical issues there. Markus, I don't know if you want to.
No, I think you made the most important points. Yeah.
Okay. And you were happy with that answer, Eric.
Is it on? So I appreciate the realist perspective and trying to find an institutional reform that is feasible rather than ideal. But in that spirit, what are in your view, what are the main challenges or dangers with a wage earner fund? Like, you tell me but like as an example, like what's the ability of companies to attract capital, or what's the quality of decision making? How is that affected by a reform like this?
Great. I guess this returns to some of the issues that have already been brought up. I mean, just to pick up on Moa's point as well, I guess is the threat of capital flight nowadays is pretty different from the 70s, ever since the deregulation of capital markets. So I guess that would be one major worry that would have to be solved in some way if we were to wholesale endorse some kind of modern proposal. And as you brought up, the opposite of that perhaps the ability to attract capital to the country, as that has this kind of scheme in place. I also think that one of the things that Bo brought up earlier is important as well. What about the equality between workers in companies with wage earner funds and without wage earner funds in different sectors? Or, I mean, if the funds work differently, well, I mean, some of them basically create more profits for their workers than others. I mean, that's a kind of inegalitarian effect of these kinds of funds that sort of goes against the whole idea of introducing them to begin with. And I think one special case of that, or the even more pressing issue to do with that right now is, I guess, so I mean, say that people are worried about decreasing productivity or increasing automation or whatever will bring about massive levels of unemployment in the near future. I mean, say that these people are right. Then we will probably get a situation where a lot of people are outside of the labor market completely and would, of course, then not be able to access these kinds of wage earner funds. I mean, that's in the name. So if access to this kind of capital or this redistributive mechanism is restricted to people who are actually already employed and also employed in the best companies, then that sort of defeats the purpose. It wouldn't deliver the kind of egalitarian distribution that, I mean, the whole idea is to promote. So, and I think this was obvious already in the debate in the 70s, where again there was some kind of tension between the Labour Confederation and the Social Democratic Party, where again the politicians tried to sort of speak of it more like an citizens fund or something like that, more than a wage earners fund. So there was, but then again, of course, the union representatives wanted to promote the interests of union members. So, which of course are the insiders on the labor market. So that's, to me at least, one of the main issues that would have to be dealt with in some kind of revamped proposal. You know, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think I'd agree entirely on like the capital flight worry and then the kind of insider-outsider effect. I mean, just on that, the tension between, as it were, the reasons that we might have to redistribute some both economic return from capital and some control over the use of that capital to people kind of qua workers, and then to people kind of qua citizens. I mean, I think that tension is kind of an interesting one. So you could certainly imagine a version of this kind of proposal, if enacted, where you had just a highly segregated labour market, where you had, you know, a bunch of people for whom work was fantastic, right? Because they're getting a labour and a capital income from it. They're kind of engaged in sort of deliberation about the direction of their companies, and then you have a bunch of people on the outside of that. One quite severe solution to this problem was actually the version of this proposal that was in the 2019 UK Labour election manifesto. Capped the, so you could have a maximum of a £500 annual dividend to workers within any particular firm, and then capital returns above a certain amount were just going to be kind of, you know, pulled back into the treasury and used for general social purposes. So you know, when the Financial Times or the Economist wrote about the Labour Party proposal, they're saying, well, you know, it's just a kind of fancy form of corporation tax, right? It's no more than, you know, another element of the tax system, but with a little bit of, you know, kind of a few sort of ornate kind of details to it. So I mean, on the one hand, I suppose that was a way of sort of setting one way of setting the balance between, as it were, the kind of workers' interest within particular enterprises and then the kind of broader social interest. But that I suppose ended up with a version of this that might not have some of the benefits that other versions of it might have. So I think this fits, as it were, I think, with our kind of our modest conclusion that just as with basic income or basic capital or whatever it might be, this is like it's a kind of policy, it's a kind of institution. It could come in really quite different varieties, and puzzling out which version of that would actually strike the right balance between some of these different interests and would avoid some of these different problems. I mean, that's kind of the normative problem to be solved. And being aware of some of these difficulties as one does that is pretty important. Mark?
Please join me and thank the speaker for a
thank you.
interesting and thought-provoking talk. We have seminars coming up. November 16, we have Ilya Viktorov, The Rise of Collateral-Based Finance under State Capitalism in Russia. That's something for you. And then we have somebody called Bo Rohrstein who's going to speak about populism, epistemic democracy, and equality of government, coming up November 23rd. And December 7th, we have said Hormio, individual emissions, equality, and the state. Very welcome.